Story Part 1. What was the worst job in a medieval castle? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the stone corridors, smoky kitchens, and echoing halls of a medieval castle. So, if you're tucked comfortably beneath a blanket, perhaps with the lights turned low, this is your invitation to settle in. Let your breathing slow. There's no rush tonight. We have plenty of time to wander through history at a gentle pace. Castles often appear magnificent in films. Their towers scrape the sky. Their banners flutter proudly in the wind. Lords and ladies stroll through camlet halls wearing velvet and silk as if everyday life were one long royal banquet. It's an attractive picture, a slightly exaggerated one, naturally, because castles were also cold, damp, noisy, and smelled rather more complicated than modern tourism brochures prefer to mention. Behind every noble feast stood hundreds of ordinary workers, whose names rarely entered the history books. Their reward for endless labor was usually another day of endless labor. Some jobs were respectable, others were exhausting. A few were so unpleasant that one wonders whether they came with any salary at all, or simply a sympathetic nod from the steward. Tonight, we're searching for the worst job in a medieval castle. Not the most glamorous, not the highest paid. There often wasn't much pay to begin with, but the occupation, most likely to leave you cold, filthy, exhausted, and questioning every decision that had led you to this particular hallway. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, our journey begins with toilets. Not because medieval people enjoyed talking about toilets. Quite the opposite. But everyone needed one, even kings. Especially kings. Royal digestion, despite the best efforts of court poets, followed much the same rules as everyone else's. Most castles used what were known as garderobes. These were small stone chambers built into thick walls with a wooden seat, placed over a vertical shaft. Gravity handled the rest with quiet efficiency. It was simple. It required no plumbing. It also created one rather obvious problem. Someone eventually had to clean it. This unfortunate soul was often known as the gong farmer. Despite the impressive title, there was very little farming involved. The word gong referred to human waste, not musical instruments. Anyone expecting a peaceful career surrounded by vegetables instead found themselves climbing beneath castles with buckets, shovels, and a determination that modern job descriptions rarely demand. Cleaning usually happened at night. This was partly because fewer people wished to witness the process, which seems fair enough, and partly because castle life continued throughout the day. Nobody wanted the morning feast interrupted by workers carrying barrels whose contents were unmistakable. Imagine descending into a pit beneath towering stone walls. The air is thick. The floor is damp. Your only light comes from a smoky lantern. Above your head sits an entire castle, hundreds of people, dozens of fireplaces, great feasts, royal celebrations, and every single meal eventually contributed to the task waiting below. It was not glamorous work, yet it was absolutely necessary. Without regular cleaning, waste accumulated rapidly. Overflowing garderobes attracted insects, rats, and disease. Castles could become dangerously unhealthy surprisingly quickly. So while nobles admired stained glass windows and discussed hunting falcons, somebody else quietly prevented the entire residence from becoming uninhabitable. History rarely remembers those people, which feels a little unfair. The king might have won a battle. The architect may have designed magnificent towers, but neither accomplishment mattered very much if the toilets stopped working. The work itself was physically demanding. Buckets filled quickly, ladders became slippery. Winter brought freezing temperatures. Summer made everything smell considerably more enthusiastic. Naturally, protective equipment did not exist. No rubber gloves, no waterproof boots, certainly no pleasant lemon-scented disinfectants. Just heavy clothing, determination, and perhaps a willingness to avoid thinking too deeply about one's career choices. Many medieval workers believed bad smells caused illness. This idea, called miasma theory, remained common for centuries. Ironically, while foul odors themselves were not responsible for disease, working around untreated waste certainly exposed laborers to dangerous bacteria and parasites. The risks were very real. Cuts became infected. Contaminated water spread sickness. Simple accidents could become fatal. And yet the work continued because castles simply could not function without sanitation. Oddly enough, Gong farmers sometimes earned better wages than many servants. That sounds surprising until you remember that very few people volunteered for the position. Supply and demand has always possessed a rather dry sense of humor. If almost nobody wants your job, employers occasionally become generous. Not enormously generous, just generous enough that someone reluctantly agrees. Our gentle walk through the castle now drifts upward, away from the toilets and toward another enormous workplace that looked wonderful from the dining hall but felt rather different from inside. The kitchens. A medieval castle kitchen never really slept. Long before sunrise, fires already burned beneath massive iron cauldrons. Servants carried water. Others chopped vegetables. Bread baked in great ovens. Meat roasted over open flames. Smoke drifted endlessly toward timber rafters blackened after years of cooking. It was hot, exceptionally hot, especially during summer. Imagine standing beside several roaring fires while carrying heavy pots from one end of the room to another. Now repeat that every day. The youngest workers often began as kitchen boys or girls. Their duties sounded simple: fetch water, carry wood, wash dishes, turn spits, scrub tables, clean floors. Unfortunately, each simple task involved remarkable amounts of effort. Water rarely came from a nearby tap. It had to be carried from wells or rivers. Firewood required chopping, stacking, transporting, and constant replenishment. Large castles burned astonishing quantities of wood every single day. One meal for hundreds of people demanded careful coordination. The Lord ate first. Guests followed. Important officials next. Soldiers after them. Servants often ate last, once everyone else had finished. Sometimes the leftovers were generous. Sometimes they weren't. Kitchen servants learned not to complain, or at least not loudly enough for the cook to hear, because medieval head cooks possessed authority approaching that of military commanders. Mistakes delayed meals. Delayed meals annoyed nobles. Annoyed nobles occasionally punished everyone, which meant dropping a tray could become a surprisingly memorable experience. One particularly exhausting task involved turning roasting spits. Large animals rotated slowly above open fires for hours. Someone had to keep them moving continuously. Too slow, and one side burned. Too fast, and cooking became uneven. Some castles eventually installed clever mechanisms, powered by dogs running inside wheels. Yes, small dogs literally ran inside giant wooden wheels to rotate roasting meat. The dogs undoubtedly had opinions about this arrangement. Sadly, history neglected to record them. Where these machines did not exist, servants performed the work by hand, hour after hour, watching meat rotate, slowly, very slowly, which somehow feels both exhausting and deeply hypnotic. Perhaps medieval castles accidentally invented relaxation videos centuries ahead of schedule, although with rather more smoke and considerably less background piano music. The constant heat created another problem. Water. Workers drank frequently when supplies allowed. Dehydration was common. Sweat-soaked clothing. Burns happened regularly. Sharp knives waited everywhere. Heavy iron cookware crushed fingers and toes without apology. Yet meals still appeared on elegant tables upstairs, perfectly roasted, beautifully presented, almost as though dozens of exhausted workers had not spent the entire day, making them possible. The nobles admired the feast, complimented the seasoning, discussed politics, perhaps complained that the venison was slightly overcooked. Because, of course, someone always complains. Meanwhile, downstairs, another servant quietly scrubbed grease from enormous cooking pots that weighed nearly as much as the servant cleaning them. History often remembers banquets. It remembers kings. It remembers victories. It rarely remembers the teenager, standing ankle deep in cold water trying to scrape burnt porridge from the bottom of a pot larger than a bathtub. And perhaps that's a shame, because those invisible workers kept castles alive every single day. As the evening settles further around our old stone castle, we'll continue wandering through its quieter corners where rat catchers, laundresses, stable hands, sleepy guards, and many more unfortunate souls are still waiting for us. But those stories can wait just a little longer. As our gentle journey through the least enviable jobs in medieval life has only just begun. Part 2. How did ancient Egyptians fall asleep without beds or pillows? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back more than 4,000 years to the quiet banks of the Nile, where the evenings arrived with warm breezes, flickering oil lamps, and the steady chorus of insects hidden among the reeds. If you've had a long day, now is the perfect moment to settle in. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your thoughts wander gently into the ancient world. When most of us picture bedtime, we imagine a mattress, a soft pillow, perhaps a blanket that somehow twists itself into impossible knots before morning. Ancient Egyptians, however, approached sleep rather differently. At least, that's the popular belief. You've probably heard that they slept on the floor with nothing beneath their heads except a hard block of wood or stone. It sounds deeply uncomfortable, rather like volunteering to spend the night in a museum gift shop. As it turns out, the truth is both stranger and far more interesting. The ancient Egyptians certainly had beds. In fact, some of the oldest known beds in human history have been discovered in Egyptian tombs. They simply weren't beds in the way we think of them today. There were no deep spring mattresses or memory foam carefully engineered to remember exactly how sore your back already was. Instead, a typical Egyptian bed was a wooden frame raised above the floor on sturdy legs. Across this frame, craftsmen stretched tightly woven cords made from leather or plant fibers. The result looked rather like a modern camping cot. It flexed slightly beneath the body while allowing air to circulate underneath, which, considering the Egyptian climate, was actually quite clever. Imagine the difference between sleeping directly on warm sand after a scorching day and resting a short distance above the ground where cooler air could move beneath you. Suddenly, the design seems less primitive and more practical. Of course, not everyone owned such a bed. Ancient Egypt was a remarkably unequal society. At the very top stood the pharaoh, whose sleeping arrangements were elaborate enough to make even the most luxurious hotel seem modest. Below came nobles, priests, military officers, and wealthy merchants. Then came skilled workers, farmers, laborers, servants, and everyone else whose names history mostly forgot. Your bedtime depended largely upon your place in that social ladder. A royal bedroom might contain beautifully carved wooden furniture, decorated with ivory, ebony, or even thin sheets of gold. Delicate linen covered the bed, and fine woven blankets were brought out during the cooler months. Incense drifted gently through the room, filling the air with scents of myrrh or frankincense. Meanwhile, a farming family in a small mud brick house might simply spread woven reed mats across the floor or sleep on a much simpler wooden frame with little decoration. Comfort, as ever, was something wealth could usually improve. Even so, Egyptian homes were surprisingly practical. Thick mud brick walls kept daytime heat outside for many hours. Flat roofs often served as living spaces during the evening. Once the fierce afternoon sun faded, families climbed onto their rooftops to eat, talk, and sometimes sleep beneath the open sky. This wasn't merely pleasant, it was sensible. Inside the house, the air could remain warm well into the night. Up on the roof, a gentle breeze from the Nile often made sleeping considerably more comfortable. Naturally, this arrangement depended upon the weather behaving itself, which, unlike kings and tax collectors, usually did. Now, about those famous pillows, or rather, the remarkable lack of them. Instead of soft cushions stuffed with feathers, many Egyptians rested their heads upon objects that modern people would probably mistake for unusual sculptures. These were headrests. Most surviving examples were carved from wood, though wealthier families sometimes owned versions made from ivory, alabaster, or finely polished stone. At first glance, they appear astonishingly uncomfortable. A curved cradle sat atop a narrow column attached to a broad base. Your neck rested against the curved support while your head remained slightly elevated. It sounds less like bedtime and more like an appointment with an especially confident chiropractor. Yet appearances can be misleading. The headrest supported the neck rather than cushioning the entire head. This reduced contact with warm bedding, allowing air to circulate and helping sleepers remain cooler during hot nights. In Egypt's climate, that mattered far more than it might in Northern Europe. There was another advantage. Insects, mosquitoes, ants, beetles, and various other determined little creatures shared the Egyptian landscape with enthusiastic persistence. Raising the head slightly made it more difficult for insects to crawl across a sleeping person's face. It wasn't perfect. Ancient mosquitoes remained entirely unconcerned by furniture design. but every small improvement helped. The headrest also carried deep symbolic meaning. Egyptians believed the head was especially important, not only during life, but after death. Protecting it was considered essential. For this reason, beautifully carved headrests were often placed inside tombs alongside beds. Clothing, jewelry, and everyday possessions. The deceased, it seemed, deserved a comfortable night's sleep for eternity, or at least the best version of comfort available around 1500 BCE. Sleep itself occupied an unusual place within Egyptian religion. It was not merely a biological necessity. Many Egyptians believed dreams carried messages from the gods. A vivid dream might reveal advice warnings, guidance about the future. Temples sometimes welcome visitors, hoping to receive divine dreams through ritual sleeping, a practice historians call dream incubation. Imagine arriving at a temple after making offerings, washing carefully, saying prayers, and then lying down to sleep, hoping that somewhere during the night a god might choose to answer your questions. It's a wonderfully peaceful image. Although one suspects the mosquitoes occasionally interrupted divine communication, the gods themselves were closely connected to sleep and protection. The dwarf god Bes, with his curious appearance and cheerful determination, often appeared painted on bedroom walls, carved into furniture, or worn as an amulet. He was believed to guard families during the vulnerable hours of darkness, frightening away evil spirits within. Expression that could politely be described as enthusiastic. He was perhaps the only protective deity whose official strategy involved looking alarming enough that monsters simply decided to bother someone else. A surprisingly effective career choice, really. As darkness settled over the Nile Valley each evening, daily life slowed. Farmers returned from the fields. Craftsmen packed away their tools. Bakers allowed their ovens to cool. The constant sounds of labor gradually gave way to quieter conversations, distant music, and the occasional bark of a village dog, reminding everyone that nighttime belonged to different creatures altogether. Without electric lights, evenings were naturally shorter. Oil lamps provided only modest illumination, and fuel was valuable. Most families simply found it easier to sleep soon after darkness arrived and wake before sunrise. The rhythm of life followed the sun, and unlike modern alarm clocks, the sunrise never forgot to show up. At least not yet. We'll continue our gentle journey through ancient Egyptian nights in the next part, where we'll explore bedrooms inside royal palaces, the linens that touched a pharaoh's skin, bedtime rituals, strange beliefs about nightmares, and why even a simple night's sleep was woven into one of history's most fascinating civilizations. Story Part 3. What happened to orphaned children in the Middle Ages? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the winding streets, quiet villages, and towering castles of medieval Europe. So, if you've settled beneath a warm blanket and the room has grown pleasantly dim, let your breathing slow. There's nowhere else to be. Tonight, we're following the lives of children who rarely appeared in royal chronicles or grand paintings, yet quietly shaped the medieval world in ways history often overlooked. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they usually picture kings in shining crowns, armored knights, bustling marketplaces, or perhaps an exceptionally dramatic castle siege. What they rarely imagine is a small child standing alone after losing both parents, wondering where tomorrow's meal might come from. Sadly, this was not an unusual story. Life in medieval Europe was uncertain. Disease spread quickly. Childbirth was dangerous. Famines arrived without much warning. And wars had an unfortunate habit of wandering through peaceful villages at the worst possible moment. Many children lost one parent before reaching adulthood. Some lost both. There were no government orphanages, no social workers, no adoption agencies, no official safety net waiting quietly in the background. Instead, an orphan's future depended almost entirely on family, neighbors, local customs, and sometimes a surprising amount of luck. If the child belonged to a farming family, the first hope was usually relatives. An uncle might take the child into his household. A grandmother, if she was still alive, might become the child's guardian despite already struggling to care for herself. Older brothers and sisters sometimes became parents almost overnight, despite still being children themselves. Family responsibility was deeply important in medieval society, not simply because people were unusually generous, although many certainly tried to be, but because survival often depended upon cooperation. Every pair of working hands mattered, even very small ones. A 7-year-old might gather firewood. An 8-year-old could help feed chickens. A 10-year-old might already spend long days tending sheep or carrying water from the village well. Childhood, as we understand it today, was remarkably brief. Work began early. Responsibility arrived even earlier, and grief rarely paused the harvest. If relatives could not care for an orphan, the local village sometimes stepped forward. Neighbors shared food. Families rotated responsibility. A widow living alone might welcome a child who could help around the house. In return, the child received shelter, simple meals, and some measure of protection. It was rarely an easy arrangement. Most medieval families lived only slightly above poverty themselves. Another mouth to feed meant thinner bowls of porridge for everyone. Still, many communities believed caring for vulnerable children was both a practical duty and a Christian obligation. Not everyone lived up to that ideal, but enough people did that countless children survived who otherwise might not have. The medieval church also played an important role. Monasteries and convents occasionally accepted orphaned children, especially if local families were unable to help. Some children eventually became monks or nuns. Others simply worked within the religious community until adulthood. Life inside a monastery was quiet and highly structured. Days followed the ringing of bells. Prayer alternated with work. Meals remained simple. Silence was often encouraged. For a frightened child arriving from a village devastated by plague or famine, such routine may have offered an unexpected sense of safety, though perhaps not much excitement. Then again, excitement in the Middle Ages had an unfortunate tendency to involve invading armies. So quiet. Routines were often the better bargain. Not every orphan entered religious life willingly. Some families dedicated children to monasteries because they genuinely believed it, offered security. Others simply lacked the resources to raise them. Economic necessity has influenced family decisions throughout history. The Middle Ages were no exception. For children born into noble families, orphanhood looked rather different. A Young lord who inherited land after his father's death became incredibly valuable, not necessarily because everyone admired him, but because everyone admired the land. Guardianship of wealthy orphans could become a political prize. Kings sometimes claimed authority over noble children, appointing guardians who managed estates until the heir reached adulthood. In theory, this protected the child's inheritance. In practice, some guardians treated the estate rather generously toward themselves. Fields produced crops, villages paid rents, forests supplied timber, income flowed steadily. One can imagine the temptation. Naturally, medieval history contains more than a few guardians whose accounting methods displayed remarkable creativity. The orphan eventually inherited whatever remained. Hopefully, marriage added another layer. A wealthy orphan girl might find her future decided long before she understood the conversation. Her guardian often arranged a marriage that strengthened alliances or rewarded loyal supporters. Love, while not entirely absent from medieval life, rarely received the final vote in aristocratic family meetings. Practicality usually won. Romance occasionally arrived later. Sometimes, if everyone was fortunate. For poorer children, life was generally more straightforward, though hardly easier. Many entered service while still young. A village craftsman might accept an orphan as an apprentice. The child learned a trade in exchange for food, clothing, and a place to sleep. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, bakers, and millers all relied upon apprentices. Training lasted years. The work was demanding, but it also offered something precious: a future. An apprentice who mastered a craft could eventually earn independent wages, marry, and build a household of their own. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. And hope, even in small amounts, has always been remarkably valuable. As the evening settles over our quiet medieval village, we'll continue following these children's lives in the next part. We'll explore apprenticeships inside crowded towns, the difficult reality faced by abandoned infants, how the Black Death transformed childhood forever, and the extraordinary resilience of young people growing up in one of history's most uncertain ages. Part 4. What was the most dangerous job for a woman in ancient Rome? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back nearly 2,000 years to the bustling streets, crowded apartment blocks, and marble temples of ancient Rome. So, find a comfortable position, let the day slowly fade away, and join me as we wander through a world that was both magnificent and remarkably unforgiving. When we picture ancient Rome, it's easy to imagine triumphant emperors, disciplined legions, grand amphitheaters, and senators wrapped in spotless white togas. History has a habit of placing powerful men at the center of the stage. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary women quietly carried the empire forward, often under circumstances that were exhausting, dangerous, and almost entirely overlooked. Tonight, we're asking a surprisingly difficult question. What was the most dangerous job a woman could have in ancient Rome? The answer isn't as straightforward as it might seem. Unlike modern societies, ancient Rome didn't have official occupations neatly listed in government records. Women's work blended into family life, household businesses, farms, workshops, and marketplaces. Many jobs carried risks that Romans simply accepted as part of everyday existence. An everyday existence, rather inconveniently, could be quite hazardous. For most Roman women, life began before sunrise. The streets were still dim as oil lamps flickered behind wooden shutters. Bakers had already begun preparing bread. Donkeys pulled heavy carts through narrow alleys paved with uneven stones polished smooth by generations of feet. Smoke drifted upward from countless cooking fires, carrying the smell of fresh bread, charcoal, olive oil, and occasionally drains that reminded everyone sanitation remained an ambitious work in progress. If a woman belonged to a wealthy household, she likely supervised servants, managed stores of food, oversaw spinning and weaving, and kept detailed accounts. Roman writers praised the ideal matron who governed her household with quiet efficiency. They admired order, discipline, and modesty. Naturally, they said considerably less about how much work this actually required. Most women, however, were not wealthy. The vast majority belonged to farming families, artisan households, or the growing urban population packed into Rome's towering apartment buildings. Known as insulae, these multi-story wooden structures leaned over narrow streets, sometimes reaching 5 or 6 floors high. They were crowded, they were noisy, and they had an unfortunate tendency to catch fire. Living there was dangerous enough. Working there added another layer of uncertainty. Many women earned money weaving cloth. At first glance, weaving appears peaceful. A quiet room, a wooden loom, the steady rhythm of thread passing through thread. It sounds almost meditative. Yet weaving demanded endless hours of repetitive movement. Fingers cracked from dry wool. Shoulders ached. Eyes strained in dim light. Wool carried dust and tiny fibers that filled the air day after day. Roman writers rarely complained about these conditions. Then again, they generally weren't the ones spending 12 hours at the loom. Some women sold vegetables, fruit, fish sauce, bread, or pottery in crowded marketplaces. Every morning, they lifted heavy baskets, negotiated with customers, and hoped to earn enough coins before the day's heat became overwhelming. Markets bustled with noise. Merchants shouted prices. Animals wandered between stalls. Children darted through crowds. Pickpockets searched for opportunity. Occasionally, a startled mule decided that today was an excellent day to ignore everyone. Traffic accidents, though involving considerably fewer automobiles, remained surprisingly common. For poorer women, physical labor never truly ended. After hours in the marketplace came cooking, fetching water, grinding grain, repairing clothing, looking after children, preparing tomorrow's meals. Sleep arrived late. Morning came early, and the cycle quietly began again. Perhaps the greatest danger of all, however, was one faced by almost every woman regardless of wealth: childbirth. Modern medicine has transformed childbirth into something far safer than it once was. Ancient Rome had experienced midwives, practical knowledge, and herbal remedies, but none of the tools that today make complicated deliveries survivable. There were no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no emergency surgery as we know it. An infection from a seemingly uncomplicated birth could become fatal within days. Heavy bleeding often could not be stopped. Babies delivered in difficult positions frequently placed both mother and child in grave danger. Roman families understood these risks all too well. It is one reason why prayers to protective goddesses accompanied pregnancy so often. Hope and faith filled the gaps where medicine simply could not. For many Roman women, the most dangerous work they would ever do was bringing new life into the world. It happened inside ordinary homes, without applause, without monuments, without victory parades. Yet it required extraordinary courage. As our evening walk through ancient Rome continues, we'll soon meet tavern workers, entertainers, textile laborers, wet nurses, priestesses, and women whose occupations carried risks few history books ever pause to mention. Their stories rarely reached the marble statues of emperors, but together, they reveal a very different side of the Roman world. One lived far from the Senate and much closer to the ordinary rhythms of everyday life. Part 5. How did people survive winters before modern heating? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world where winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a season to be respected, prepared for, and, with a little luck, survived. So settle into your favorite blanket, let the room grow quiet, and join me as we wander through snowy villages, smoky cottages, and ancient homes where warmth was never guaranteed. Most of us experience winter with a simple twist of a thermostat. Within minutes, warm air fills the room. Radiators quietly hum, or underfloor heating works its invisible magic. If we're especially adventurous, we might even complain that the living room is 1 degree cooler than we'd prefer. For most of human history, however, staying warm demanded constant effort. Heat wasn't something you switched on, it was something you earned. Every log chopped in summer, every bundle of straw stored beneath a roof, every animal sheltered inside a barn, and every stone carefully placed around a hearth became part of an elaborate plan stretching months into the future. A forgotten pile of firewood in July might become a very uncomfortable conversation in January. Long before the first snow arrived, families were already preparing. Across Europe, farmers cut and stacked enormous quantities of wood. The logs needed months to dry properly. Freshly cut wood burned poorly, producing more smoke than warmth, which was rather disappointing after spending an afternoon carrying it home. Those who lived near forests often collected fallen branches whenever possible. Nothing useful was wasted. In regions where trees were scarce, people became remarkably inventive. They burned dried peat dug from marshes. They gathered animal dung, shaped it into flat cakes, and left it to dry in the sun. They bundled heather, reeds, and even straw. It may not sound especially glamorous, but winter has always encouraged practical thinking over elegant solutions. Inside the home, nearly everything revolved around a single source of heat: the hearth. It was the heart of the house in every sense of the word. Meals were cooked there, water was heated there, stories were told there. Children played nearby while parents repaired tools, spun wool, or mended clothing. At night, the last glowing embers were carefully covered with ash to preserve enough heat for the following morning. Starting a completely new fire every day was difficult. Keeping yesterday's fire alive was much easier. The smoke, however, presented another challenge. Many early medieval homes had no chimney. Instead, smoke drifted upward toward a simple opening in the roof, taking its time along the way. The room filled with a permanent haze. Walls darkened with soot. Eyes watered. Clothing absorbed the smell so thoroughly that one imagines. Even the family dog probably smelled faintly of campfire. Visitors arriving from another village likely carried exactly the same aroma. Nobody noticed. It was simply the scent of home. Beds offered only modest relief from the cold. Few people slept beneath thick feathered duvets. Instead, they layered wool blankets, sheepskins, and whatever warm materials were available. Several family members often shared a bed. Children slept together. Servants shared sleeping spaces. In poorer homes, everyone gathered into the warmest corner of the house. Privacy, as we understand it today, was considered a luxury. Warmth was much more important. It turns out another human being is an excellent source of heating, not particularly adjustable, but very reliable. Some households even welcomed animals indoors during the harshest weather. Chickens might roost near the entrance. A goat could occupy one corner. In smaller cottages, a cow occasionally spent the winter only a few steps away from the family's bed. Modern readers may find the idea unusual. The cow almost certainly found it equally unusual. Yet large animals produced an astonishing amount of body heat. Their presence helped warm the building while protecting valuable livestock from freezing temperatures. The arrangement came with certain aromatic compromises. Fortunately, medieval noses were considerably more accustomed to such negotiations than ours. Clothing became another layer of insulation. People rarely owned wardrobes filled with seasonal fashion. Instead, they wore several layers of wool, linen, and fur whenever possible. Nightcaps covered the head. Wool socks stayed on in bed. Cloaks sometimes doubled as blankets. Every layer trapped precious warmth. Even so, mornings remained bitterly cold. Imagine climbing from a warm blanket into a room where your breath hangs visibly in the air. The floor beneath your feet feels like cold stone. Water left overnight may have formed a thin sheet of ice. The fire has almost died. Before breakfast, before conversation, before anything else, someone must coax those sleepy embers back to life. As our winter evening gently unfolds, we'll continue exploring how castles, monasteries, Viking longhouses, and ordinary cottages endured the coldest months of the year. We'll discover why medieval windows were surprisingly tiny, how hot stones warmed beds long before electric blankets, and why surviving winter often depended less on courage than on careful preparation. Many months before the first snow ever fell. Story Part 1. What really happened to prisoners captured by medieval kings? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the age of towering castles, muddy battlefields, and kingdoms where victory rarely marked the end of someone's story. If you're already comfortable, settle in just a little deeper. Let the day's worries drift away. And join me as we quietly explore what happened after the fighting stopped. History tends to linger on the great battles. We hear about charging knights, fluttering banners, and kings making speeches that were almost certainly shorter than the films would have us believe. Eventually, one side won, the other side lost, and the history book politely turned the page. For thousands of prisoners, however, the most uncertain part of their lives was only just beginning. Being captured by a medieval king could mean almost anything. It might lead to wealth. It might lead to years of captivity. It might lead to freedom. Or it might end before sunset. As was so often the case in the Middle Ages, much depended on who you were, who had captured you, and, perhaps most importantly, how much someone else was willing to pay for your return. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval kings did not automatically execute everyone they captured. That would have been remarkably expensive. Dead prisoners could no longer pay ransoms. Living ones, on the other hand, represented opportunity. And medieval rulers were generally quite fond of opportunity. If you happened to be a wealthy noble, capture was oddly preferable to heroic death. A nobleman in shining armor was not simply another soldier. He was, in effect, a walking investment. His family owned land. His relatives possessed influence. His friends commanded armies. Most importantly, they often had money. Lots of it. Knights quickly learned that capturing an important opponent alive could be far more profitable than defeating him permanently. Battles sometimes became surprisingly selective. Rather than striking the final blow, victorious soldiers might surround a fallen knight and loudly announce that he was now their prisoner. The prisoner himself often agreed. It was, after all, considerably healthier than the alternative. Of course, agreeing to become a prisoner did not make the experience pleasant. A captured noble might be escorted to a castle many days away. There he would wait while letters traveled across, kingdoms requesting payment from anxious relatives. These negotiations could take weeks, sometimes months, occasionally years. Fortunately for wealthy captives, imprisonment often resembled uncomfortable house arrest more than the dark dungeon of popular imagination. A high-ranking prisoner might receive private rooms, decent meals, servants, books, and even permission to walk within the castle grounds. After all, mistreating an expensive prisoner was rather poor business. No one pays a generous ransom for someone who has already died from neglect. Kings understood this perfectly well. Common soldiers faced a very different reality. Few possessed wealthy families capable of paying substantial ransoms. Many were released after swearing never to fight again. Some were forced into labor. Others remained imprisoned only briefly before being exchanged during negotiations between rival kingdoms. Sadly, not everyone survived captivity. Food shortages affected prisoners before anyone else. Disease spread rapidly inside overcrowded castles. A single outbreak of dysentery or fever could pass through prison cells with alarming speed. Medical care was limited. Clean water was often scarce. Even those who survived battle sometimes found imprisonment to be its own quiet struggle. Despite these hardships, medieval castles were not always filled with endless rows of prisoners. Long-term imprisonment was surprisingly uncommon. Keeping captives required food, guards, space, and money. None of those came cheaply. Whenever possible, rulers preferred practical solutions. Collect the ransom, arrange an exchange, secure an oath of loyalty, then send the prisoner home. Naturally, there were exceptions. Some prisoners were simply too dangerous to release. A rival claimant to the throne, a rebellious duke, a troublesome cousin with an inconveniently strong family tree. Royal families had an astonishing talent for producing relatives who regarded succession as a competitive hobby. Such captives could spend decades behind castle walls. Their rooms might be comfortable enough, their meals reasonably generous. Yet every sunrise looked much the same as the one before. The seasons changed outside. Kings grew old. Wars began and ended. Children became adults. Still the prisoner waited. Sometimes hope proved more durable than freedom itself. As our quiet journey through the medieval world continues, we'll soon meet famous royal captives, unfortunate princes, imprisoned queens, and the extraordinary castles that served as both magnificent homes and remarkably expensive prisons. Their stories remind us that, in the Middle Ages, surviving the battlefield was often only the beginning of a much longer and quieter test of endurance. Story Part 7. What was it really like to be a servant in a medieval castle? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting through the heavy wooden gates of a medieval castle, not as a king returning from battle, nor as a noble preparing for a lavish feast, but as someone history rarely paused to notice. Tonight, we are the servants who quietly kept the entire castle alive. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the sounds of the modern world slowly fade away. Imagine the crackle of a distant hearth, the gentle flicker of candlelight against ancient stone walls, and the soft echo of footsteps long since vanished into history. When people picture medieval castles, they usually imagine glittering banquets, armored knights, elegant ladies in embroidered gowns, and lords issuing commands from great halls. It is an appealing picture. It is also, rather conveniently, missing most of the people. A large medieval castle might house well over 100 servants, and during festivals or military campaigns, that number could climb even higher. Every candle that burned, every loaf of bread that appeared on the table, every polished suit of armor, and every freshly made bed existed because someone had quietly spent hours making it happen. Servants were the invisible machinery of the castle. When everything worked well, nobody noticed them. When something went wrong, everyone certainly did. For many servants, the day began long before sunrise. The castle still slept beneath the darkness as a handful of workers quietly stirred the embers. In the great hearth, fires had to be revived before anyone else awoke. Water needed carrying from wells. Bread dough had to be prepared. Wood was stacked beside fireplaces before the morning chill reached the noble chambers. There were no alarm clocks. The rhythm of the castle itself became the clock, the crowing of roosters, the ringing of chapel bells, the first pale light creeping across the horizon. These were enough. Sleep was rarely luxurious. Junior servants often shared cramped sleeping rooms tucked beneath staircases, inside lofts, or high in the attic beneath wooden beams mattresses, if they could be called that, were sacks stuffed with straw. They worked well enough for a while. Eventually, the straw flattened, then shifted into mysterious lumps. Replacing it became another task on someone else's list. Privacy hardly existed. Several servants might sleep shoulder to shoulder in the same room, their belongings fitting inside a single wooden chest. Clothing was practical rather than fashionable. Most owned only a few outfits, carefully repaired whenever they wore thin. Nothing useful was thrown away. A torn tunic became patches. Old blankets became rags. Broken tools were repaired whenever possible. Medieval castles were surprisingly skilled at recycling, though they would probably have found the modern word rather confusing. After a quick breakfast, often coarse bread, pottage, and perhaps a little ale or watered beer, the real work began. Kitchen servants hurried towards smoky kitchens already glowing with heat. Stable hands disappeared into barns where impatient horses announced their breakfast rather loudly. Housemaids swept rushes from stone floors, replacing them with fresh herbs that helped soften unpleasant smells. Laundry workers gathered enormous piles of linen, tunics, towels, and tablecloths. Someone polished silver. Someone chopped vegetables. Someone carried messages. Someone cleaned fireplaces that had only just finished warming the rooms overnight. Every task depended upon another. If the firewood arrived late, the cooks fell behind. If the cooks fell behind, breakfast was delayed. If breakfast was delayed, the Lord might begin the morning in an especially disagreeable mood. History suggests that powerful people have rarely enjoyed waiting for breakfast. Some traditions never truly disappear. Not every servant performed hard physical labor all day. Senior officials held positions of remarkable trust. The steward managed supplies, wages, accounts, and the overall running of the household. The chamberlain supervised the private apartments of the lord and lady. The butler, despite modern assumptions, was responsible not only for serving drinks, but also for valuable wine cellars, expensive cups, and careful inventories. These positions demanded literacy, organization, and complete loyalty. A careless mistake involving the Lord's finances could prove rather memorable, and not in the pleasant sense. Even so, most servants occupied the lower ranks. Their work was repetitive, demanding, and almost endless. Yet castles could also provide opportunities unavailable elsewhere. A clever young servant might learn reading, bookkeeping, cooking, blacksmithing, or horsemanship from experienced workers. Over many years, some rose through the household, earning greater responsibility, higher wages, and a respected place within the castle community. Life remained difficult, but it was not always hopeless. As the candles burn a little lower and the great hall gradually grows quiet, we'll continue our gentle walk through castle life in the next part. We'll explore feast days from the servant's point of view, the exhausting work of laundresses and scullery maids, the trusted messengers who carried royal secrets, and the surprising friendships that sometimes formed among the people whose names rarely appeared in medieval history, yet whose work made every castle possible.